something unusual is happening in the commodity markets. Copper is making new highs, gold is making new highs, and governments are suddenly talking about stockpiles, strategic reserves, and supply security. When a metal moves from being just an industrial input to something governments want to store and control, that tells us the market may be entering a different regime. In our strategy, we focus less on predicting prices and more on understanding mechanisms. One of the clearest mechanisms right now is how security concerns can change the entire commodity supply chain. When governments begin discussing strategic reserves for metals like copper, the buyer base changes. Demand becomes less price-sensitive and more time-sensitive. The question stops being how cheap the metal is and becomes how quickly supply can be secured. That shift can ripple through the entire system. Copper is not simply mined and sold as finished metal. Much of it moves through a chain of concentrates, smelters, refiners, and processing facilities. If concentrate becomes scarce relative to processing capacity, pressure shows up in the middle of the supply chain before it ever appears clearly in the price chart. This is why midstream economics matter. Treatment and refining dynamics can quietly reveal when processors are competing for material. When those signals appear at the same time governments are prioritizing domestic supply, it suggests the market may be transitioning from a purely cyclical commodity environment towards something closer to a strategic resource environment. Another mechanism that often gets overlooked is capital intensity. Copper projects are large, expensive, and slow to develop. The bottleneck is often not geology. The bottleneck is funding and permitting. Even a high-quality deposit can sit undeveloped if the capital structure cannot support the timeline required to build the project. That is why projects that combine copper with gold can sometimes attract a wider capital base. Gold revenue can act as a financial bridge that helps unlock the copper project behind it. In other words, the geology might be copper, but the funding pathway can be diversified through additional metals. If you find these kinds of mechanism-driven breakdowns useful, consider subscribing. The goal here is to help you see the signals that shake market regimes before they show up in the headlines, so you can interpret what markets are doing, rather than reacting to the noise after the fact. Now, when we map this environment into the Our Strategy framework, we see conditions that still resemble late Phase 1 behavior, but with rising Phase 2 pressure underneath the surface. That means markets can continue higher, even while structural stress slowly builds in areas like credit, funding markets, and supply chains. Our base case assigns roughly a 60% probability that Phase 1 style conditions persist through the middle of 2026, assuming liquidity remains supportive and credit conditions remain stable. At the same time, we see about a 40% probability that Phase 2 compression begins to dominate within that same window if liquidity momentum slows and market breadth deteriorates. Beyond that horizon, we monitor the possibility of Phase 3 credit stress developing toward the end of 2026, conditional on widening credit spreads and weakening labor confirmation. A more severe Phase 4 style liquidity event remains a lower probability scenario that would require clear signs of funding stress, auction instability, and correlation spikes across markets. Quick note before we continue. Everything discussed here is educational and analytical in nature. It is not investment advice or a recommendation to buy or sell any asset. So what would confirm that the strategic commodity narrative is becoming structurally important rather than simply a headline story? We watch for policy actions that move beyond announcements. Real signals include procurement programs, strategic stockpile purchases, processing incentives, and permitting reforms that actually accelerate project timelines. At the same time, we watch market internals. If liquidity remains strong, credit spreads remain calm, and market breadth improves, then the commodity strength we are seeing may remain a supportive background trend rather than a stress signal. The key takeaway is simple. When governments begin treating industrial metals as strategic assets, the sequencing of the market can change. Supply chains tighten, capital flows shift, and new participants enter the buyer base. Our job is not to predict exactly what copper or gold will do next. Our job is to watch the signals that reveal whether the system itself is changing. Because when the structure of the system shifts, the outcomes that follow often look very different from what traditional narratives would suggest.